Okay, so hi everybody, and welcome to the latest Ask the Expert webinar from OneServe. So as you guys will know, probably because I think I know most of the people who've logged in, my name is Gareth Spuler, and I'm a technical analyst at OneServe. So if you haven't spoken to me before, welcome to you guys. So today's topic will be all around workflow. So it's kind of worth noting that in these sessions, I won't have time to cover everything in workflow. So I'm going to focus on a couple of aspects. One is kind of altering, and one is kind of a few hints and tips for if you're creating a workflow yourself. If you've never done any of it before, you may have a few questions, but it doesn't make today not worthwhile. But if you've got some understanding, then that will kind of help you through today. Okay, so one of the first things worth considering around workflow is how we build it and how it fits together in the system. So I actually have like a little overview diagram on here. So looking at this, the thing that's really important is we have concepts of like a worklog type, a work type, and a workflow. So what you have to think about is if you're creating a new workflow, you need to make sure that you add it in the backend in the admin section to make it actually work. And that link is at like a work type level. So if you're ever creating a new workflow, once you've actually created the workflow, you need to add it to a work type, and then you need to check that that work type is referenced by a worklog type. So as an example, you might have a high-level worklog type for repairs jobs. You might have two work types underneath that, one for carpentry and one for plumbing. So you need to make sure that the right work types then point to the workflow that you've created. So you need to make sure that those things are in place in order for the workflow to be picked up and for your jobs in the front end to follow that workflow. Okay, as usual in these, obviously we'll record this and people will get this sent out to them, but as always, you've got the Help Centre. And again, as always, there is loads and loads of helpful information in the Help Centre about workflows. So if I click, I've opened up the Help Centre, so what I've done there is click on the question mark, and I've opened up a second tab. And in here, you've got all the links. The one that's particularly useful is the creating a new workflow. So if you're ever going to create from scratch and you're looking for a helpful document, in order, everything is laid out there that you need to do. And we'll come back and have like a little look at that later. But also, obviously, the data in there is helpful if you're going to add a step or amend a step in any way in your workflow as well. The other thing I would recommend, definitely, if you're going to create a new workflow, is to pick a tool basically that will allow you to draw a diagram of it. So people often talk about how looking at the workflow in the system, it isn't that clear where things are going. So the only way to get around that, and what we always do here is if we're creating new workflows, is to draw it out, or even if it's an existing workflow and you're not sure about where it goes, again, you need to just diagramize it. So we've got a free tool here that's just called Lucidcharts. It's just a free piece of software. You can pay for licenses, but I've got a free version. And if I open up that tab, I have an example here that I'm doing for a client at the moment that I've kind of unbadged. And I would recommend, so basically the boxes show steps, the arrows show transitions when you're moving between the steps. And although it's kind of logical to lay it out left to right, if you do that one of these tools, you'll find you'll run out of space quite quickly. So we tend to do top to bottom representing left to right. So what I've got here is an example where I've got 3 potential appointments, but then I want to stop it after that. And then obviously I'm branching out here. This is kind of saying they never attended in job closed. I've also got practically complete, and then we're feeding down here to actually kind of financially and substantially complete the job. So it's definitely worth using a free tool like that or Visio. There are loads about in order to draw a diagram before you start. Okay, so what I'm going to look at first is amending workflows, and I thought I'd cover a couple of areas. One of them is adding a new step to your workflow, and the other one is removing a step from an existing workflow. So what I've set up is I have a gas servicing process, and you can see on the left-hand side, I have some views that I've created already against it. And if I click into one of those jobs, I can see on the right-hand side, I've created a workflow called Simple Service, which is the workflow that I'm going to use and edit today. So within the job, if I click on Simple Service to take me into that workflow, I have a workflow here that's got quite a lot of steps in it and quite a lot of transitions in it. It's worth noting that in recent times, we cleaned up the screen a little bit. So the transitions are now, they're narrower and kind of slightly clearer about where they go, so you can see more on the screen. and there's no delete button. There used to be a load of delete bin buttons. You have to go into it to delete it, which again just makes it like a little bit tidier. Okay, so what I'm going to do in here is, you don't really need to understand exactly how this workflow works, but basically, after you complete the appointment, there's a certificate and worksheet check around, probably checking the CP12, and after that, the job goes to a job complete status. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to add in a new step, and I'm going to put that step between the certificate and worksheet check and job complete, and I'm going to add a step for checking photos. Okay, so adding a new step tends to be easier because there can't be any jobs currently on that status in this workflow. So when you add a new one, that difficulty doesn't exist, and we'll talk a little bit about that more when we talk about deleting a step or amending a step. So all I'm going to do is, first of all, the bit that I always forget, in order to edit the workflow, you need to create a draft. So up in the top corner, I'm going to click on Create Draft, and that creates me a draft. Once I'm in a draft, I can do whatever I want with a draft, and the live jobs are still looking at the actual live workflow. However, as soon as I publish the workflow, so effectively I publish the draft, you're working off the workflow that you've changed. So don't publish a workflow unless you're certain that's what you want, because you cannot go back to the one after you've published. Okay, so I'm going to add a step. Once I've added the step, I'm going to think about kind of fitting it in with the transitions so that everything knows where it goes and it flows through. Okay, so I'm going to add a step in, and I'm going to call my step, I'm just going to call it check photos. Okay, so in the new world, in the last kind of couple of upgrades, one of the changes we've made is to allow you to customize workflows in various different ways to make them fit your business better and to avoid confusion when you were perhaps using generic statuses before that had been developed for something else. They didn't quite fit what you wanted, and they're maybe not clear as to what exactly was happening. So we've created the ability on the fly, so when you're in the workflow, to add a new job status as you're going along. Okay, so what you're doing is you're actually creating a definition status that you can then use in other workflows, and I can show you where those things live later on, but for now I'm going to add a new job status. And to keep it nice and simple, I'm going to give it the same name as the step, which I think just makes things clearer, because every step has a job status. If you name them together, it avoids confusion between the two. So I'm just going to call that check photos. I have to pick a job status group, so this one is incomplete because it's after the job's been done. It's part of the completion check process, so I'll make that green, and I'm just going to keep my check photos in there. Okay, so I'm going to create that, and I'm going to save it. Okay, so I now have an extra step in my job called check photos, or in my workflow I should say, but at the moment I haven't got any transitions coming out of it, and I haven't got any transitions going into it. Okay, so the transitions, the little bits in blue, they're effectively the buttons that users are pressing to move a workflow between steps, so to change the status. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, after we've checked the worksheet, rather than going to job complete, I'm going to alter this transition to go to my check photo step. Okay, so the transition already exists. I think I can get away with just changing the destination step. My new step appears, so I can say, yeah, make that go to check photos now. And then I'm going to just scroll down and I'm going to save that transition. Okay, so now I'm saying that from certificate and workflow check, when that's okay, rather than completing or going to job complete, I'm going to go to check photos, which is down here. Okay, the problem with that at the moment is obviously my check photos doesn't go anywhere, so I'm going to add a transition in here to take me to job complete. So again, I click on the action, I say I want to add a transition this time, and then I name it. Okay, so by clicking on this transaction, you're basically completing the job, so I'm just going to call it job complete, because that's where it takes me. I'm going to give it the same description. I can add a little note that pops up, you don't have to, but I'm going to say only choose if photos are correct, and I'm going to take it to job complete. So I've got a gas job complete event in there. Okay, so I'm sort of saying here, by clicking on it, the name of the button equates to the destination step you're going to. Sometimes people have it where this is the action and the destination step is what happens after you complete that action. But again, that's for you to decide really as to what works best for your users. In the transition view, I have a basic transition screen which just allows me to capture a note if I was to add a note onto that. Okay, I'm going to leave transition note type and not bother with that. I'm going to say 1 for the button sequence, which just shows left to right the order they appear in, so I've only got 1 on there. Okay, for now, I'm not going to add a permission right, but we'll come back and talk about that in a little bit, because that's another fairly new piece of functionality that we've added on there. I am, in post functions, going to choose to add an event. Okay, so just like the job statuses, we've now opened it up so you guys can create your own event types and add events in there. So you can name it whatever you like. The event is the entry that goes into the job history. So it allows you to have an audit of exactly where each job has been as they're moving through that workflow. So again, now I can name that whatever I want. So what I want to do is, I want to say, whenever we've gone through that step and that transition is run, I want to add an event in saying that we have checked the photos. So I'm going to pick job actions as the job event because that's the event type that I know already exists. It's been created. And then I'm going to add a new event into that event type. And again, I'm going to call it photos checked because the transition comes after you've done the check. So I'll call it photos checked, and I'll make a note of that because I need that later. Okay, and then I'm going to put it in that job actions, which already existed, but it's just event types that have been created by users, so then you can add and take away from them. Okay, so I'm tailoring it so that when it goes through there and it's complete and it moves on, I will add an event into the history to say the photos have been checked. So even when it moves away from that job status, I've got a record in the history to say that it's taken place. Okay, and then I'm going to save that. Okay, so if I've done it right, what I'm looking at now is I've got a certificate and worksheet check. If I say that's okay, I move to check photos. If my photo check is okay, I can do job complete, and that will take me to job complete. Okay, so when I'm doing training, this is the bit that I love to forget and makes me look silly. So in order for that workflow to be picked up, I need to publish the workflow. Once I publish it, any jobs on that workflow will feature or will go through the new step that I've created. So if they're after that step, it won't affect them, but if they haven't reached that step yet, it will affect them. And I'm going to publish that workflow. Okay, so what I have at the moment is, if I go back to the search screen, I have a load of jobs on that workflow at certificate check. So at that status that I created a little view for. So there should be a state of certificate and worksheet check. Okay, and if I've done everything right and everything is updated, when I complete it, yep, you can see it now. Okay, so that change that I literally just made is being picked up on this job that already existed, which is how it should work. So when I hover over certificate and worksheet, okay, that used to take me straight to job complete. It now takes me to my new destination of check photos. So if I click on there, I'll put a note in saying, like a bit overkill, but I'll say photos checked. And I will say that's all good. Okay, so now I've moved to my new status of check photos. And if I look in the job history, I've added in my event for job completed that I added in. That's interesting. Okay, I also have to, because of the way I built it. So if I then say, yep, I've checked the photos and my job is complete, you can see the little text, only choose if photos are correct. I added in, so sometimes that's a nice little prompt that not many people really use. So once I complete the job, I'll add in the photos checked event, because that should only happen once you've actually done it. So again, back in my job history, I've now added, which is the one I was looking for before, photos checked. So the job complete I should probably take out when I was cleaning it up, but the photos checked is now in there. And that's the new event that I created. Okay, so then what I can do is, as a quick little test for photos checked, is I can now report in the views on jobs with that event in them. So rather than looking at the job status, I can report on the event. So even if the job has moved much further along in its workflow, I can say, were the photos checked? Show me all those jobs. And I can set myself up a view. In order to do that, I need to go and get a code for that new event that I've created. So if I go into the admin area, I have new menus for events, event types, and already that was there before, but allows the new ones to be added for job statuses. Okay, so if I go into events, what I can find is the definition of the new event that I created, and it should have the word photo in it. Okay, so I've now got an event called photos checked, and that's the definition of that event I created for that workflow. So I could go away now and I could use that event and add it to transitions in other workflows if I wanted to. But I'm just going to pinch the code, the CE code. So any that you create yourself now will get a code that starts CE, and then numerically it's just going up. Okay, so if I take that code and then I put back into the views, this will take a little bit of time. So I've already created a pot called photos checked, but it doesn't use the right event, it uses a slightly older one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to update that now to reflect my event that I added. So I'm saying any jobs on the simple service workflow with a work type of gas servicing where I've added that event in. And if I click, it will show me the job that I've run through. If I save that one, photos checked. Okay, so that allows me to then pick up jobs where I've added that event in. So I can use that view syntax, which again is all documented in the Help Center, and I can report on jobs to say, I just want to check that all of those servicing jobs had their photos checked. I know they're invoiced, for example, now, but I can look back on that view and see where that's taken place. So that's kind of a really useful bit of functionality. Okay, just to cover, so in the admin area, when I was creating the workflow, I added a new job status like on the fly, and I also created a new event, so the photos checked on the fly. And in here, I can see in job statuses, in the events, in the event types, where those definitions of those are stored. So it is possible to come in here first, create a new event or a new job status, then go into the workflow and select it from the menu, rather than creating it on the fly. So you've got both of those options in there. Okay, while we're talking about that, another fairly recent change that we've added in there is around the rights. So if I just pop back into that workflow. Okay, so I have a simple service workflow. I could create another draft. I'll tell you, I won't even create it, I'll just talk this bit through. So what it is possible to do now is if I look at a transition, so I pick the one from check photos, we've always had this bit here around the permissions right under conditions. And the way it always has worked is basically you choose an existing right from the system from a limited list, and then anybody with a user type that has that right will see that transition. So it's a way of controlling who can push workflows through. So what we've recently added is the ability to add a new custom right here. Okay, so to limit access to transitions to only certain user types, select right that only the user types you wish to give access to the transition have. Alternative, custom right can be defined and the right given only to the user types, blah, 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 blah. So what we're saying is, before, there wasn't always a link. You were saying, oh, those user types have got that right, I'll just kind of use it. Whereas now you can create a new right and name it and give it a really sensible name. So you could call it ability to check photos here. If I was to create a new draft, I can then add it in here, and then I can decide which users have that. So it's really clear. So I would then be able to go and look at user type rights and say, okay, if I'm looking at finance users, do they have that right in here? And you can give it a sensible name. So it's just another little bit of customization. So it's really clear who should have access to that transition in the workflow and who doesn't have access, because you can create the custom right, you can name it, and then you can give it to the user types that you want. Again, I can do that on the fly, so I could have done it by creating a draft and added it in there, or I can come in here and I can just create a custom right in here and decide who gets access to it. So if I was to click on the plus, I give it a name, I give it a description, and I choose the user types who have access to that right. I then add it to a transition, and that controls who can push the workflow through. So custom rights, custom events, and custom job statuses are all relatively new additions that just allow you to kind of push those workflows through more quickly and create them on the fly. Okay, so around existing workflow, the next thing I'm going to show you how to do is to remove a step. Okay, so when you're removing a step or even altering a step like changing the job status, what you have to be really careful of is whether or not you've already got jobs on the workflow at that job status, so at that step, because it won't let you remove them if you have, which makes sense because you don't want to take 100 live jobs that are at that status and just chop them out because it doesn't know where to put them and you're losing visibility of those jobs. Okay, so I'll show you kind of a way around doing that and how to kind of identify where those jobs are and clean it up a little bit. So I'm going to go and pick the same workflow. I'm going to find it in there. And then I'm going to, again, because I'm going to amend it in some way, I'm going to create a draft. Okay, so then what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to say for certificate and worksheet check, I don't want that step anymore. So I'm going to say maybe the check photos is enough, or I'm going to amalgamate, maybe afterwards I'd rename, so this says check worksheet and check photos. So I've only got one step for that. So ruthlessly, I'm going to chop out certificate and worksheet check. So on the actions, I choose to delete, and I delete that out, and I say, yes, please. Okay, so once I delete a step, it looks like it lets me do it. It's when you go to publish that workflow where it will point out if that's not possible because there are already jobs there. So if I click on publish, it will say unable to publish workflow as job exists in a status that is not linked to a step in the new workflow. Okay, so I know that's my jobs at check worksheet. Okay, so what I also know is I created that workflow recently and nobody else should be using it in this demo system. So I can quite easily identify the jobs that are at that job status that I've chopped out, and I can deal with them in some way to allow me to come back and make the change. So I'm going to leave simple service at draft. I'm going to go back in, and I have built a list of views that equate to jobs on the workflow that I've created. So if I go to certificate check, all I'm saying here is show me all the jobs with a job status of certificate and worksheet, which is the one that I want to remove, and they're on my workflow simple service. I've also got a work type in there, but I don't have to. Okay, this is, for me, should work okay because my setup is fairly simple, but it may be that you've got the same workflow used across several different work types, in which case it will take you a little bit longer to identify those and clean them up. But using the views, you should be able to identify all the jobs that you want on that workflow at that job status and move them in some way. Okay, so this is like a useful tool for moving them on. If, as in mine, they're the same work type and they're on the same workflow, in the views there's the functionality to move them on to the next step. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take everything at certificate and worksheet and I'm just going to move it on to the next step in the workflow. So there shouldn't be anything sat there. So the views groups them for you, which is really useful. So build the view. I've only got 3 here. I can then use this button to bulk edit those jobs. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to push them onto the next stage. So I select the 3 that I want. I click on next. Okay, I'm going to bulk job update. I click on next. And then all I'm going to do is choose the transition. So I'm going to pretend that I've checked all those worksheets en masse and move them down the route as if that was done. Okay, when I click next, they should move on. So it's just going through and doing that. Okay, so I should have moved those away. The views will take like a little while to update. So if that process works and I haven't missed anything, I'm going to start losing the plot. Go to completely the wrong area. Okay, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back into the simple workflow that I created. And if that works and I haven't missed any, I'm already in a draft. I should be able to now publish that workflow. Okay, so that worked. So what I did there was I went and identified the jobs in that workflow that were at the status that I wanted to delete. I moved them on using the bulk edit and moved them on to the next stage in that workflow, which still exists, and then I deleted it. And when I came back to delete it, it let me do it because I identified for myself that there weren't any jobs on that status in that workflow. Okay, the other thing you would still have to do, which works just the same way as when you add one, is clean up your transitions a little bit. So because I've chopped one out, the transitions around here won't point to the right places. So you just need to just check through and make sure they point to the right places. Mine is a bit of a mess, but I'm not going to use it. I'll tidy it up later. So I'll just leave that as it is for now. Okay, so I've just spent sort of 5 or 10 minutes now just talking through kind of useful hints and tips for if you were going to create a new workflow. I don't have time to create one and go through it all because literally as a piece of training that would be like half there a day's training with people creating them. But I can give you kind of useful hints and tips that will help you get started and help you down the line. I will also take questions at the end. So I didn't mention that at the start, but I will take questions at the end, give people a little bit of time to think, and I can unmute you so I can hear you talk and you can share questions. There's also the email address, the hello@oneserve email address, which you can fire questions to if you prefer to do it that way. And then through marketing, I'll pick those up and get back to you. Okay, so if you want to create a totally new workflow, the first thing is you need to know how to link that in. So that goes back to the bit I talked about at the start. So looking at this structure. So in order for a workflow to work, it needs to be linked to a work type. In order for that to get picked up, it needs to be linked to a work log type. So there's lots more about that kind of relationship between those three in the Help Center, but that's really important. I've seen people create a new workflow that they've perhaps just called repairs and then expected all the work log type repairs jobs to automatically pick it up, but they won't. You have to build that structure. So the workflow has to be linked to a work type, the work type has to be linked to a work log type, and you need to push jobs down there. Once that works, it will work as a template, so it will work for all the jobs you create like that, but thinking about like services and usage types on sites to make sure everything links together is really important. So if you create a workflow and for some reason jobs aren't picking it up, that would be a good place to go and have a little look to get started, just to make sure that it should be getting picked up. Okay, this is a bit like I can't emphasize enough. So if you're going to create a new workflow from scratch, don't just go into the workflow tool and start adding steps and having a go. Draw a diagram and lay it out how you want it. So again, like plug in other people's software. I use Lucidcharts. This is actually one that I'm creating, like I was saying before, for a live client, and I've mapped it out. Okay, because what you've got within the workflow is it isn't linear. We have non-linear workflow, so it's possible to branch and it's possible to loop back on yourself. And there isn't really a way of displaying that in the front end. So drawing out as a diagram first is a really, really sensible thing to do. So here I've got some kind of process around creating a job and 3 potential appointments, which if we complete any of them will take us down to practically complete. And then job closed, that question marks will be some kind of process around we haven't actually attended. So then how do we deal with that? I've also got in here a potential rollback state to say if we complete and practically complete, say we check the photos and the work and it's not good enough, we can roll it back and start again. So I've mapped out the eventualities, I've made a few notes around how it will work, and then I've got a little process down the bottom thinking about stuff like adding an invoice number. So little other bits of the workflow that I can add and control in there. Okay, when it comes to actually creating it in OneServe, things to consider. You can copy an existing workflow. So I didn't know about this for quite a long time, but on the actions menu, I can start by copying. So if you've got a workflow already that's fairly close to what you need, don't start again. Just copy it, rename it, and then edit what you want inside of it. So adding the steps, taking away the steps, renaming transitions, etc. I would definitely go down that route if you don't need to create a new workflow. Inside of the workflow, so if I just go back into simple, if I could spell, which I can't find. Okay, so if I pick anything on there, I don't want to create another one. Okay, so I created a copy of it the other day. So what the workflow does try to do, as you're creating it, it can't order it in the exact order because it's non-linear. So it doesn't know if it's looping back. It doesn't know if it's branching, but it does order it by the link job status colors. So blue is job status color of pending. In this case, green is complete and purple is invoiced. There's also orange that can sit in here for in progress. So the workflow screen does try to put them in some sort of order to give you a guide. So it'll go blue, then orange, then green, then purple, if you pick the right colors to go with your job status. Okay, one of the ones that always throws everybody is this. If you're creating a new workflow, okay, so people always create the new one. Newly created has to be in there. It's just a step that we use at the start, so you can't delete it or remove it. But people always want to edit it and say, oh no, I want it to point somewhere else. So you can't actually edit this one, but you can edit. Ooh, we might have changed that. That looks like I can now. But you can edit the subsequent step, and this one will then point back to it. So in the Help Center, when you're creating your workflow, if I flip back, there is a little bit in here, which is that bit there. So first job status has always been newly created, that explains how that process works. So how to get started with those first couple of steps, and then it's just a case of going through and creating what you want. When I create a new workflow, I wouldn't worry about transitions. I'd always add steps first. So add all the steps in that you want, then think about adding the transitions. I do it in that order. Okay, another useful thing is the mobile can interact with your workflow. In order to set that up, you need to look at view properties. So if I click on view properties, there's a couple of bits that I can set in there. I can say when the appointment starts, move the job to be in progress, and that goes off the color setting. So it's looking from blue to orange, orange being in progress. I've also got a complete that does a similar thing. It will say when all the work is complete on that job, if it's the final appointment, then move the job on from a orange status of in progress to a green complete status. So the mobile can interact, does for most people, and that's how you go about setting that up. Another important thing about the mobile is bearing in mind that the mobile can handle additional appointments required, so further work, carded, those kind of things can be managed on the mobile device. So you can just have the job in OneServe on the desktop sit at an in progress job status, and you can have the mobile manage that because it puts an entry in the job history. You can create views that look at those entries, have somebody pick those up, and schedule another appointment. So there's a decision to be made there when you create a workflow about whether you want the mobile to handle that, which is what most people use most of the time, or maybe, for example, for guests, you only want them to attend 3 times, and if they can't get in after the 3rd time, you stop and there's some kind of legal process or a different process, in which case you might want to manage that in the workflow itself rather than in the mobile. So in the example I was drawing out earlier, I'm trying to manage that process here in my workflow. I've got a first appointment, a second appointment, and a third appointment. The reason I'm managing it in the workflow is because after the 3rd appointment, I don't just want to keep going round and round. I want the workflow to stop and move somewhere else and say, that's your lot, you've had 3 goes, we're not attending again, that job's effectively complete in some way. Final tip, after you're done creating your workflow, don't forget to publish the workflow. So what you'll find is if you don't publish it and you link to it, then your jobs will just fall over and you try and move them on, and they'll spend ages trying to fix that, and then all you've done is not publish the workflow. So that's my final useful hint for today. Okay, so what I'll do, guys, is I will mute you for a couple of minutes. If you ever think about any questions you might want to ask, and then if you put your hand up in the little attendee panel, I can then unmute you and you can ask your questions, or they can go to that email just if you want. So I'll just mute you for a little while and give you a couple of minutes.